for those who don't understand how depreciation works, when you go to file your taxes and you own real estate, there's ways to make money. There's income, right? Like Albert made us $4,500 in cash. There's depreciation, which means you're writing off the value of the home over 27 and a half years that work as a tax benefit, meaning you're lowering your taxable income by that amount. And then there's also appreciation. The home is gaining in value. So Sheridan is technically a tax advantage because we're writing it off of our net income, but we actually lost $1,400 in cash to that home this year. So it didn't probably appreciate much. It didn't cash flow, but it did give us a tax benefit. We have to really weigh the benefits because sometimes having tax benefits help. Other times the cash loss is worse than the tax benefit.
Welcome back to the Pursuit of Property podcast. We are here with our first episode of the new year. It is just Mr. Scotty Farrow and I sitting down to talk today. How you feeling, dude?
I'm good. I am reflecting on the story I put a little while back. Dude, we started in April of 2020. This is our 5th calendar year doing podcasts. That's kind of wild to think about.
Dude, kind of crazy on the timing because we are coming up on this year will be also 5 years into owning some single family houses out there in South Bend. So podcast started the same year, went out a little bit later and bought 9 houses, sold off a few, and now we're sitting at 5 still standing. And I think that's the topic of conversation today. For a little bit of backstory, Scotty and I, this is our first time sitting down together to look at and review our rental entity P&L from 2024. So not only looking at it by property, but also looking at our entity as a whole to see how things performed in 2024 and what's kind of going on in our minds as we explore some options based on this P&L.
Yeah, and let's start by clarifying, this is the part of the business nobody talks about when you own rentals, is there's a financial aspect that requires, it's not like wildly complex, but it requires understanding and paying attention. And so shout out to my wife, Kayla, who spent all the time this year keeping track of all the expenses, managing them so that we could have this report here today. So Kayla, I know you have not listened to a single episode, but shout out to you.
There it is. Well, man, let's kick it off. So like we already talked about, there are 5 properties that we've still got in the portfolio. All 5 of these we now have on long-term debt. Mm-hmm. When we first purchased in 2020, we've gone through these refinances kind of sporadically, just trying to tackle down the refinances when we could. But at this point, all 5 remaining are on long-term debt with various different mortgagors. And where do you want to start?
I guess when we're doing a review like this, and for full disclosure, we were going to do this offline tomorrow.
Yeah.
But we decided we would record this. This is a legitimate meeting that we're having. So the goal of today's meeting is really just to get a sense of where each property is at, get a sense of where the portfolio is at as a whole. And then we're in a partnership that are at 2 different stages of life. I just had a kid. You're about to get married. You just bought a house. Like, we are in different financial circumstances than when we purchase these properties. And so each year we need to look and say, okay, how does this play into our current plan? How is this helping our families? What do we need to do? So we're likely not going to make any decisions today, and this is just going to be an introductory conversation as to what we're going to do with projects in 2025. But we ultimately bought these with 2 goals in mind: cash flow and tax write-offs. Mm-hmm. We didn't really expect much appreciation. That was one of the discussions we had when we bought these. Yeah. Listen back to season 2 to hear live thoughts as we were buying these. But we have experienced some appreciation, and that was the cherry on top. And now we're going to look back and say, when we did our BRRRRs, right? Buy, update, rent, refinance, repeat. Where did it go? How did it play out? And like from what I just said, we're going to look individually at each project because these are all single family homes. And then we're going to look at the portfolio as a whole.
Yeah, so this year, I know we were just chatting offline right before we started. Just general thoughts on how the year went. We struggled with more than a couple vacancies. I think out of the 5 we had, what did we say?
3.
At any given point, 3 properties were vacant.
Not at any given point. At any given point, 1 was vacant.
At least 1 was vacant.
Yeah.
And that was one of the things we really struggled with. I think when we have these properties on the other side of the country, different weather, people move a lot slower over in Indiana than they do in California. Our longest vacancy is probably the one that is still currently vacant.
No, it was...
What was Wellington longer?
Wellington was 6 months.
And I think we're coming up at least close to that mark so far on Sheridan.
Last payment on Sheridan was October.
Their exit payment?
Uh-huh.
Okay, so we're about 3 months into that one. And so when you guys when we think about this, it helps that there's other properties that can help make up the slack, right? Now, when you have a property on long-term debt and there's nobody in there that's paying you the rent, we're still on the hook to pay the mortgage and pay the bank every single month, not including, any other renovations or anything we have to do to bring that thing up to speed. So I think that was one of the big pain points this past year in terms of the portfolio. 3 vacancies throughout the year. 1 that was vacant for 6 months. Another one that's coming up on being vacant for 3. The other one was vacant for about 4 to 6 weeks, which is not that bad. But I think when we look at this past year as a whole, that's really what hurt us significantly, the big pain point being vacancies.
Yeah, and it was a point, not even just financially, it was a frustration.
I
think we host a weekly meeting on Wednesday mornings where we talk about the podcast, the rentals, and then the core business. And every week it felt like the same conversation came up. What do we have to do to get this rented? What do we have to do to get this rented? So it's just something to be aware of. Indiana's a smaller community than California, and South Bend itself is a smaller community than Fresno.
Yeah.
So there's less renters to fill vacancies. In Fresno, you run 104-ish doors in Fresno. What is the average vacancy time in Fresno?
Yeah,
if you were to ballpark
maybe 4 weeks.
Okay, so
max,
on average,
at least what we've been dealing with right now in the slower season.
Right, correctly priced rentals in Fresno are moving at about a month. So this is totally different. I want to start with Albert. Let's start with the good news and go down from there. So Albert is, you can look this up, 230 Albert Street in South Bend, Indiana. This is a great example of a burg gone right. So rental income this year was $10,400. So what's that monthly payment? $950?
Comes out to, we did a small bump throughout the year. They were at $850 and now they're at $900. So between that combination. Yep.
So the blessing here is we collected 12 full months of rent from the tenant on time. No vacancies, no issues with payment. So that's rare. And you're going to hear that through this podcast.
And what's interesting about Albert is that is the original tenant that we put in there after doing some updates back in 2020. So that tenant has been in there, has never been delinquent on their rent. They have paid on time every single month. Like you said, this is the golden child of the portfolio.
And this is when people talk about passive income, this is what they're talking about.
This exact
This
property.
person requires very little effort. We always get them a Christmas gift. We try to always be helpful for their family because they are very helpful for us. So $10,400 in rent was our income. And the way P&Ls work, you start with income, then you have expenses, then you have net. And net is all that really matters. So expenses for the year, we paid $774 for insurance on the home this year. And that's required by the mortgage company and, always keep insurance. We paid $1,546 worth of interest. So when you hear people talk about a mortgage, they talk about PITI, principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. So the interest that we paid the bank for our loan was $1,546. That's not our mortgage. It's just the interest portion. Then you have management fee, $832. So our agreement with our property manager is a percentage of the rent collected. So this person has the largest upfront management fee because we collected the most rent. So expenses so far, $775. Let's call it $1,550, $850. And then you have repairs and maintenance. And this is, I think, actually interesting. It's $2,043, which is about 20% of the income. That seems a little bit high.
Yeah. And it's the second highest between all of the 5 properties.
Did we do a roof? No.
We did not do a roof. Albert, there was some high ticket code enforcement items that got called out. That was a section of it. And part of Albert's detached garage needed to be addressed the past year too. So between code enforcement and some garage items, we're sitting at 2,000.
Again, anything for this tenant, we try to be quick and helpful on because they pay on time. That is a big indicator that we want to keep them. Mm-hmm. The last thing you see is property taxes here, which comes out to $741. So again, of that, what people call their mortgage, principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. You know, Kate, can you do the quick math? 775, 1550, and 750? 750,
40, like 2,900, $3,000.
So about
Is that right?
Yeah, $3,000 for the year's worth for those, not including the mortgage.
Yep. And then that spits out, dude, at the end of the day. I'm trying to see here. We have
total expenses. Yeah.
Yeah. $5,937. So just shy of $6,000 in terms of total expenses. Now, when you compare that to the rental income generated, we're sitting at about 60% of that $10,400 generated in rent in expenses. Now, I think obviously this one's the big, the golden child of last year, the big winner. 60% is still kind of egregiously high, especially when a lot of the things we hear when you want to run deal analysis, account for expenses, a lot of people say to account for between 40 and 50%, depending on the asset class. So even 60% is sitting a little bit higher.
Yeah. I think the one thing to count for is that is including interest expense. And I don't think that 40% accounts for debt and interest. That 40% rule is before your
we're sitting around
your principal and interest.
Yeah. Yeah. So we do fall in that range. And then Albert, at the end of the day, giving us the biggest net income between the portfolio, and actually the only positive number between the other 4, which we'll get to. Albert, net positive, end of year, $4,512.
That is a winter project.
Winter project. I can't remember off the top of my head when we refinanced Albert. It had to have been 21 or 22.
It would have to have been 21 or 22.
21 or 22.
At a 4% mortgage.
At a 4% mortgage. At the time that was appraised, we purchased Albert for $31,250. And in 2021, call it 2021 or 2022, Albert appraised for $56,000. So even on that appraisal, now coming up on 3, maybe 4 years ago, we're not quite sure. We haven't gotten updated comparables on these properties, but $20,000 worth of sweat equity in that 1 or 2 years, which also can't complain about. That's something we were not banking on.
Yeah, I wouldn't sell Albert. I would keep Albert. As long as that tenant is there and paying, we're getting paid to own the property and maintain it. So I think Albert is a great example of a successful BRRRR.
Absolutely.
So let's just go left to right at this point.
Let's do it. All right. Next up is, you guys can also look this up. You can look any of these up. We'll share the full addresses. 124 South Sheridan. And if you look this up, you can actually probably see the rental photos. This has been up listed for rent up until about a week or 2 ago, where we pulled it down. You guys can check out the inside of this one. Sheridan was interesting. This is the one that's been vacant for coming up on 3 months. The tenant in there was also a little bit difficult. Sheridan was rented out for the highest amount of our portfolio at $1,100 a month. The issue that we also didn't talk about, that I think is probably a secondary pain point from our rentals from last year, is even the rentals that were rented out outside of Albert, we've struggled to get our tenants to pay on time and to be fully caught up on rent. Sheridan was a property where we had to be very flexible. We chose to be very flexible at the end of the day to try and keep them in there, to try and get them caught up. But they ultimately got to a point where they were multiple thousands of dollars behind in rent. And we just had to make the decision to get them out, go in and do some fixings and hopefully get it rented back out.
Yeah, we were in a spot as well where we needed to be flexible because we had other vacancies. And so this is one of those parts where, as much as you want to be hard and fast on the rules, it was in our best interest to get some money instead of none. And our experience with other rentals was that they were taking a long time to rent. And so we didn't want to have 3 vacancies at once because every vacancy was a mortgage we had to pay.
Yeah, so total rent income, just keep in mind that $1,100 number. Our total rent income for the year from last year was $6,512, which is about 6 months worth of rent from that property over the 12-month span.
For 9 months.
And yes.
So it shows you they're about $3,500 behind.
Yeah.
I think something to point out too was when we bought Sheridan, that was the fastest to re-lease out originally,
absolutely.
and it leased out for the most. So we felt like that was the most valuable asset we had. It's one of the bigger properties we have.
Mm-hmm.
We are now experiencing, we have it on the market for $1,050, or we did, and we sat. So, the rental market has softened in South Bend.
Significantly, especially with us even debating before we pulled it off to even go down to $1,000, which is $100 less than what it was previously rented out for before.
Yeah. So 6,500, that's, we're already 60% of what Albert made, and it's a bigger, better property.
Yeah.
Expenses. So taking off of the 6,500 in income, we off the bat spent $350 on appliances. We spent $1,000 on insurance because it's a bigger home. And we spent $2,000 or $2,100 on interest expense for our mortgage because we pulled out more money on Sheridan. And I believe it's at a slightly higher interest rate.
Yep. Next up, management fee. Again, this is a percentage of the property management company taking from rents that are realized. $531 to the management company, $843 spent on repairs and maintenance. And again, because this is a bigger property and the county assessing it as so, we paid a little bit more in property taxes than we did on Albert. $935 paid in property taxes.
Yeah. So looking, the next line we have is utilities. This is something to think about. When you have the property rented, the tenant pays the utility cost. When the home is vacant, the landlord is paying for the utilities. So we racked up $450 worth of just utility expenses in the 3 months that we own the property by ourselves, leaving our total expenses at $6,200. And then other expenses, such as the turn, we spent $314 in cleaning and maintenance, $1,225 in landscaping. We dealt with Sheridan had
some pest control
issues. So that's why it's $1,000. Pest was $185, leaving our total expenses, other expenses, at $1,725. So $1,725 plus 16 or 6,200. That's $8,000, leaving us at a loss of $1,700. Wait,
one
what did
below.
I just do?
Loss of $1,412 at the end of the day. Now, Sheridan, also one that we refinanced around the same time as Albert. These two properties were part of the original package of 4 properties that we bought. So Sheridan, same purchase price of $31,250. A year or two later, this thing appraised for $65,000, which was fantastic. That was the highest value that we got on that pack of original 4. So again, this one originally going in, we thought this was probably the best property in the portfolio, but just dealing with all of those issues last year with the tenants falling behind and this vacancy being longer than we would have liked.
This is also the second tenant we've had in Sheridan. In the 4 years we've owned it. We lost our guy, Donnell, and then we also lost the most recent tenant. So
we did.
Unfortunately, it's the biggest, nicest home, but it's clear that renters are not able to afford the $1,100. And so Sheridan would be on my list of properties to sell. It's already vacant. It's already pretty cleaned up. It's a nicer home that we know is valuable. So depending on what kind of equity stake we have in it, I don't know if it makes sense to rent it back out with our experience on this $1,100 a month or $1,050. So it would be one of the projects that I'd put on the potential sell list. Albert, I would 100% keep because it's paying. But Sheridan, I would say to myself, is it better to lease it back out and try to keep it and keep making money? Or if our original plan was to get cash flow and depreciation, we're getting the depreciation here, but we're not really making money.
We're not realizing the cash flow.
Which let's pause it too, because for those who don't understand how depreciation works, when you go to file your taxes and you own real estate, there's ways to make money. There's income, right? Like Albert made us $4,500 in cash. There's depreciation, which means you're writing off the value of the home over 27 and a half years that work as a tax benefit, meaning you're lowering your taxable income by that amount. And then there's also appreciation. The home is gaining in value. So Sheridan is technically a tax advantage because we're writing it off of our net income, but we actually lost $1,400 in cash to that home this year. So it didn't probably appreciate much. It didn't cash flow, but it did give us a tax benefit. We have to really weigh the benefits, because sometimes having tax benefits help. Other times the cash loss is worse than the tax benefit.
Absolutely. Next up, we've got 1618 Chapin. This one's an interesting one, man, because this one started out the year very similar to Albert. This is also the second tenant that we've had in Chapin. Started off where we were not getting calls at all about, miscellaneous stuff. This was a guy who came in, paid his rent on time every single month. I think the issue that we saw with Chapin has really been in the back half of last year. And that's where the property management company started to relay to us that Chapin was starting to fall behind, very similar to what we experienced with Sheridan. And even as we talk right now, I know that tenant is still in there. He is still behind. Him and the property management company are exploring ways through governmental assistance, other programs, to see if that's a gap that can be bridged. But I think that's where this one, we're experiencing a very similar issue. Rental income for Chapin last year, $8,687. Chapin also one that was rented out very similar to the amount that Albert was, around that $800-850 mark. We ended up giving him the bump, that small increase the first time we had done that for any of our rentals this past year. And that's, again, where we started to see those issues with them falling behind.
He started falling behind when we bumped the rent to $850.
I believe so. I think if not the exact same time, it was a very similar type time point.
It's interesting to reflect on and wonder if we should have kept it 800 if it would have kept the tenant paying on time, because 800 times 12 is what, 9,200?
9,600.
96. So we're $1,000 off in just a few months.
It's a difference of $600 in the year between 8 and 850.
It's interesting that it's something to consider when you raise rents. You don't want to leave rents at the same price for a long time because, markets change, and it's harder to go from 800 to 1,000 than it is to incrementally go up each year.
Absolutely.
To stay fair. Insurance cost this year was $662. It's the cheapest so far. Interest expense, $59.23. This is where we can talk about refining.
Yeah, so this one, Chapin is the only one. Remember, we had prefaced, and if you guys have listened into the previous seasons, we went from having 0 properties to 9, and that was separated by buying a 4-pack of properties and then a 5-pack. 4 of the 5 we still own are all those 4 from the original 4-pack. Chapin is the only one from that 5-pack that we still own. And interestingly enough, Chapin is the refinance we did later after the original 4. This was probably a year and a half to 2 years ago, about a year and a half after we did the 4. Chapin, according to the appraised value on the loan that we did, we purchased it for $31,000 because it was part of a 5-pack. That appraisal came back at $106,000 when we did the refinance. So that's a big reason why our mortgage on that thing is not only more expensive, but we're in a 7 or a 7.5% interest rate.
7.
As opposed to these other 4 where we're sitting in the 4s.
And it's important to preface, interest rate doesn't matter as much on a cheaper mortgage price. But here's the difference between $1,500 in interest expense for Albert, which is similarly priced, versus what you covered it. I don't know what it says.
Go ahead.
$5,900 in interest, because we're in the early stages of the mortgage, and the way amortization schedules work is you pay more in interest the first few years, and then it goes down. So a lot of your mortgage payment at the beginning is interest only. So $6,000 just towards interest.
Yeah, moving into our next category, repairs and maintenance here, $1,793. Management fee, which I just glanced over, $674. Property taxes, $662.94. It was interesting because I was looking at our property tax bills from our property manager. Sheridan was one that they actually, that expense is cheaper than the one we just covered on Sheridan, even though the appraised value when we did the refinance was, 1.5x what Sheridan came back at. So
it's a smaller home, and the tax assessor doesn't know necessarily the value.
No.
They normally bump when the home sells.
Yep.
Other operating income is negative $1,000. So that's something to wonder on and to look at the bank account and see what that was. But total loss on Chapin was $1,000. Mm-hmm. So, this would have been a deal that made money had the tenant kept paying. It would have been a lot like Albert, but with the hiccups in income, this one has the highest mortgage. And so it eats away very quickly and becomes a loser deal very quickly when you refi, which is another interesting topic, which is when you're going to do your BRRRRs, like when you're buying, updating, renting, refinancing, a lot of people like to refi and get all their money back out. But sometimes this is the cost. When we did Chapin, we pulled as much money out as we could to refill our owner's reserves to leverage the money in towards other projects. But the downside is when you borrow more money, the mortgage is higher. And so it can slip out of profitability very quickly versus if we had just pulled out our prior mortgage and left it, which frankly, we could have done that and left the money in the deal and it would have cash flowed. But these are instinct decisions and they're timing decisions and cash flow decisions.
Yeah, 100%. And again, this is where, as we're going through each of these, we have our trusted agent out there, and I am curious as to what now updated values she thinks would be for each of these. I think that's a huge factor in determining, as we're going property by property, what makes the most sense. Obviously, the rest of these four we're covering outside of Albert were losers, so that's never good to see. That never feels good to see. But curious on that one on Chapin.
Yeah. Next one's 261 Wellington, North Wellington. Total rent, and we probably need to speed this up. Total rent was $5,700. Total expenses were $8,500. For a net loss of $3,600.
This was the one that sat vacant for 6 months. This is one of the smaller houses in the portfolio. It's a 2-bed, 1-bath. This is one that we spent money on the turn. That tenant was the tenant we initially inherited before we got it back vacant. This was one that, if you guys follow either one of us on Instagram, this is one that I saw in person at the beginning of last year and did the walkthrough on there, filmed some content in there because it was just sitting vacant. And I think that was the hardest thing. This one, it's a funky property. It's the small house, but it's on a double lot. So there's a big amount of space, but out in Indiana, it's just grass. So I don't think that really did much for us in trying to get it back rented out. And again, 6 months. That was the biggest time we were probably frustrated with some of these properties in the portfolio. 6 months is just it. It's not only inexcusable, but I think it's a reflection on, we also have a responsibility at the end of the day to not let a property sit for 6 months, because again, all that does is month after month. Half of the year last year, we were feeding into this property. And if you guys are familiar with Michael Zuber, he talks about alligator properties where they're just eating all your cash flow. You're feeding the alligator. Wellington was an alligator last year, man.
I'm going to run the numbers real quick because we have this rented for $950.
Rented finally at $950 through, and this is what's great too. We had to get creative here. We had to talk with our property manager and really tap into the community of South Bend to see what programs, housing assistance programs, were part of the city. Because also at the end of the day, we not only wanted it rented out, but also just to continue to gain deeper connections. And I think we ended up renting it out to one of their homeless rehabilitation programs in South Bend at $900 or $950.
And so something to be aware, if this had been rented the whole year, it would have made $11,400. Mm-hmm. So $11,400 minus, what was the total expenses?
Total expenses, $8,595.
Which are higher because we paid a lot of utilities. So what's the utility bill that we paid?
$1,127.
We would have made $4,000.
It would have been in Albert.
So I think you keep Wellington now that it's in a lease with a government program that's managing the property or helping pay for it and helping keep it up. I think, it's a lot like a Section 8 program where the building is going to have to be kept in good shape. That's a cost to both the tenant and the seller to maintain the building at that level. But the fact that this lost only $3,600 with half the year being vacant, us eating the mortgage and the utilities and everything, this literally would have made $39.32 in income. So assuming that lease continues and they continue to pay on time, that's a winner deal.
And we know that property is in good shape. There's no carpet in the home. It's all new LVP flooring. That thing should hold up this year. There should ideally not be any huge rehab expenses on that this upcoming year.
So unfortunate, the 6 months killed us, but yeah. The last one is 4628 Meadow Lane. We made $6,100 and our net expenses were $8,500 again. Utilities were $662, which tells you how long it was on the market. For a net loss of $3,550. So Meadow was vacant for a while as well.
About a month and a half, probably 5 to 6 weeks.
Was Meadow, did we have to evict Meadow?
We did have to evict Meadow. So
that's where the issue was.
That was the issue there. Meadow also on the turn. We had to spend a little bit on rehab over at Meadow. That tenant that moved out left a lot of smoke damage in the home. That property still had carpet. It had it was not looking nice when we finally got in there. That was one that I was also able to walk in and see the same time I went out and walked Wellington. This one has also since been re-rented out, and we're running into the same issue on this where it's not as bad as Sheridan is, but we've started to see the past 2 months, 2 or 3 months, have to go back and check the property management portal where these new tenants we just put in have already started to fall behind. And I think this one is probably one similar to Chapin. I mean, those both need very strong temperature checks to see where that's going to end up, because that is not a great sign. Re-rented it out, spent the money doing it, and the brand new tenant in there already kind of fallen into the same trap of not paying on time and falling a couple months behind.
Yeah. So, I mean, let's tie this with a nice bow. In total, the 5 properties made $37,394. But this year we spent $40,600, and then miscellaneous expenses added another $35,000. So for a net loss of $6,600 to own these 5 properties this last year. Now we're 50-50 owners, so we each lost $3,000 in cash, but we're going to also depreciate each of the properties and provide some tax benefits, right? So that's the other part to it is, we both made some money this year, and at least, although we lost $6,000 in cash, we are going to save some money in taxes. We didn't make cash flow. They're not really appreciating because that wasn't the goal. So it makes me question the intention of holding them. if I were to, if we were to talk to our agent and we felt like we could make, 20,000 on selling Sheridan, selling Chapin, selling Meadow, if we could walk away with $60,000, split 50-50 and each get 30, it may be something I'd consider doing.
Yeah.
I would keep Albert because they're paying, and I'd keep Wellington because we just put the money into it. And now, had they been in there the whole year, it would have made money.
And Wellington's one where, again, out of the ones we've physically been into at any given point, Wellington being the most recent, Wellington's the nicest looking property in terms of just the inside of the home, the type of flooring we put in, the durability. Wellington just being the nicest of the 5, in my opinion, that we've seen. So, yeah, I mean, I think to wrap it up, seeing that loss is never a good feeling. We went through a similar exercise with a buddy of ours rental portfolio. We went through all of theirs, and he's at the point, he's got 100 plus doors, and it's looking at these properties individually and seeing, okay, what's the risk reward? What makes the most sense? We don't want to have to keep feeding these, right? Yes, when we talk about the big 3, right, in terms of the benefits of owning real estate, we are getting that depreciation. The depreciation is always going to be there, but I think it hurts when 3 out of the 5 properties, that's really all that we're getting. We're not getting the cash flow. And, we've experienced some appreciation since we bought them back in 2020. It'll be interesting to see how much or how little when we get updated comps. But yeah, it does make me ask the same question, especially for these other 3, that what really makes the most sense if we're only getting one of the big 3 back on owning those. And I know we're in the position.
There's technically 4. There's debt buy down.
Yes.
So all of these got debt buy down.
True. 100%. Yeah.
So I think overall it's a good exercise. It's a bit of a reality check. We both knew that some of these properties were really struggling. Albert gives me optimism. Wellington gives me optimism. Again, Wellington lost $3,600 this year, but knowing that it was only leased half the year, then there's opportunity to make money. But Meadow, already falling behind, recently remodeled. I think it makes better sense to move the tenant out and sell it. Chapin, falling behind, recently remodeled. I think you do the same thing. And Sheridan being currently vacant,
lowest hanging fruit,
and remodeled. Sheridan is a no-brainer. You sell
100%.
So that's how we kind of go through it. We're not looking to 1031 this money. Unfortunately, it just doesn't make sense for us to go buy stuff right now. So what we'd end up doing is probably take that money, put it back in our accounts, and if something pops up, we would pull the trigger. But I think with you getting married, buying a house, me having a kid, I think we both have places that money could go to help. And right now, the money's not really doing great for us.
Yeah. And I think we viewed this, the numbers show a loss. I think when we talk about the whole experience, I mean, it can only be viewed as a win. It's been 5 years of experience owning rentals, really being down in the trenches, experiencing what most people do not talk about, which is all of the stuff we just did, where it's really sexy to say you own doors, but really at the end of the day, how are those doors performing? And so I think viewing that as a win, viewing it as a stepping stone, again, to, like you mentioned, various stages in our lives where that money could be better utilized, and knowing that we have a track record of a strong business partnership. We have a track record of buying some good deals, even though we may have rushed into a few others. But now having that experience, having that more maturity than we did back in 2020, I think it's a testament to there's still nothing lost by selling a couple of these off.
Yeah, and I also think it's a good experience for people that are looking to buy rentals. Don't get caught up by the Instagram influencers saying, that it's passive income. Really make sure when you're running your cash flow is not the rent minus the mortgage. It's the rent minus the mortgage, minus the vacancies, minus the expenses, minus the repairs. So if you're on paper making $100 a month, I'm going to assure you that you're going to lose money, because if you're not accounting for maintenance expenses, $1,200 in maintenance a year is really not that hard. That's a water heater. That's a couple broken windows. That's, a bathroom turn in Fresno is going to be $3,000 to $5,000. That's, multiple years of no rent. So as you're running your numbers, as you're looking to buy your rentals, just understand the value of a rental is not necessarily just in the cash flow, but just know that cash flow is going to be harder to achieve with a 7% interest rate right now.
100%. Well, guys, thank you for tuning in to the Pursuit of Property podcast. If you guys have any questions, Scott referenced that whole season back in season 2 where we went through the whole acquisition process of these rentals. Obviously, this one being the year 4 kind of recap, looking at last year's performance. If you guys have any questions, we are always available, always happy to help out, and we will see you next week.
See you guys.